Welcome to Faith in 5, a weekly video devotional designed to discuss practical spiritual concepts in 5 minutes or less. I'm your host, Mark Vandella. Faith in 5 was designed with the intention of talking about practical spiritual concepts in 5 minutes or less. And so there's two different goals there. It's really taking things that are part of our everyday lives, looking for ways to just give us something that's palatable, something that we can chew on, that takes a very important part of our life, but then maps it really practically into our everyday lives. And we look to do that in a pretty short, quick way in 5 minutes or less. But sometimes the efforts of looking at what is practical, what's going on in the world around us, and how we engage that actually trumps the desire to fit something into 5 minutes. And today is one of those days. See, within the last couple of weeks, a group of people gathered, and to be honest, it was a couple hundred people gathered in the name of hate. And so they're trying to tell a story that impacts this world, it impacts our friends, it impacts the way that God wants to engage with this world. And so our goal today is to take a look at what the practical spiritual concepts and the things that we can take away from our faith and engage some of these types of behaviors in a way that's effective, that's maybe helpful. Because if you're anything like me, I've been wrestling with it. I've been wrestling with ways that I can do something different. I can make sure that love prevails over hate. And that's one of the goals of today's message. And so I told you that a couple hundred people gathered, which feels like a lot, and it's gotten a lot of traction, and it is horrible and terrible, and the things that they're saying don't have a place in this world. But I want to give you a picture of hope, because within the first 5 minutes of posting this video, there will be several hundred people that will have watched it. The same weekend that all of those people gathered in the name of hate, about 50-some million people in America attended a church service. Another 62 million people regularly give of their time to volunteer and make a difference in this world. And so I tell you that because there is hope. And yet there's hope on a grand scale. And how do we engage these individual things that are disrupting our communities, that are hurting our brothers and sisters, and that are really affecting the namesake of what God came to do through the life of Jesus? And see, the political climate and the cultural, the hate world that we're experiencing right now isn't that different from what happened when Jesus first came on the scene. See, the Roman Empire ruled through power, through hate, through fear, through war, through oppression. And the unique thing about the story of Jesus, when Jesus comes into the picture, he calls himself the Son of God. When John introduces him, he says Jesus is the Son of God. And the really cool thing about that, and there's so many different places that this aligns, is that Caesar was also known and referred to often as a son of God. And see, Caesar was the prevailing message. And he was the Son of God, and the way that Caesar believed the Son of God should rule is through power and oppression and fear and hate. And then God said, I have a different story to tell. The prevailing narrative is hate and power. The counter narrative is love, not exclusivity, but inclusivity. And the Son of God, the actual Son of God, Jesus, is here to tell a different story. And see, today our political climate and our culture isn't much different. We have a similar prevailing narrative. It's one of finding the differences in people and putting them in different categories. Because by putting somebody in a category by race, by gender, by religious belief, by sexual preference and orientation, we separate all those categories into smaller categories, and it loses its power. And so by looking at the differences, the prevailing narrative continues to win because the prevailing narrative benefits from that. The counter-narrative says, no, instead of looking at all the differences, why don't we talk about all the similarities? Because Jesus said, I came for each one of those people, individually and as a group, collectively. I came for all of them. And so the unique thing about Jesus' message is that he doesn't say that we ignore injustice, but we engage it differently. See, in Matthew 5:38 through 40, Jesus says that you've heard it said that the punishment should match the injury. This is the eye for an eye and the tooth for the tooth. If somebody does this to you, you do it back. And that's what we continue to do. The regular discourse around all the unrest and the hopelessness that we have is when we say, we call this out as wrong, we quickly point the other way and say, but I'm not as bad as they were. Or we point and say, they started it, like my brother and I did when we were 5. This requires more energy and more effort. Jesus goes on to say that not to resist evil. Don't resist the evil person. If someone slaps you in the face, then you should turn the other cheek and let them slap that one. If somebody sues you and they win and they take your shirt, offer them your coat too. And if a soldier who's come and invaded your land asks you to carry his backpack 1 mile, carry it another. This isn't, if you dig deeper in this isn't Jesus saying, let's just be passive about the whole thing and ignore it and just kind of stay in our own camps and our own little categories of different. But he's saying, let's not do it exactly the same way. Let's not fight the prevailing narrative with more prevailing narrative. Let's do it differently. Jesus isn't literally saying, if somebody punches you, you should let them beat you to a pulp. He isn't saying if somebody gets your shirt that you should strip down naked and just forgive them. But he's saying, let's engage this differently. It takes effort and it takes intentionality to tell the story that God is trying to tell through the counter narrative. See, as I've been wrestling with this and trying to figure out how do we engage this, what would I possibly say, I know a number of my friends are. And one of my friends posted something that I thought was powerful. His post said that peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. That's not what Jesus is asking from us. It's the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. It's not an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. The act of disarming evil without harming the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that's not fight or flight, but instead it's the careful, the arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. That is the counter narrative. And as I step back, it's easy to say we should do it differently. But I know that I benefit from the prevailing narrative. And if the prevailing narrative continued of othering and separating and differing, my camp, my category, being Christian, being white, being male, and being heterosexual, I benefit. When I look at the story that God is telling, He regularly enlisted people who benefited from the prevailing narrative, who stepped out of that and started telling the counter narrative. And He didn't do it with them alone. It was always a combination of people who were surprised, who were part of these other camps, some of the fishermen who were not good enough to be Jewish rabbis. Jesus is a counter narrative. He came as a humble servant. And yet God also enlisted people like Matthew, who was a tax collector for Caesar, who had oppressed and used fear and power, but stepped out of the prevailing narrative and came down to the counter narrative and started telling a different story. He used Paul, who was literally a killer of people who followed Jesus. And when Jesus got a hold of Paul, Paul stepped out of the prevailing narrative into the counter narrative, and it started to grow. The entire church that we know today was built on Paul. And even consider Luke, who may not have been in the prevailing narrative in a power way, but he had privilege. He was a doctor, or at least most understood to be a doctor. He stepped out of the prevailing narrative and started telling the counter narrative. And so if you're anything like me, you're asking questions about how do I practically discuss what God wants from me and engage in political and cultural issues, Jesus set a course for that, and He told us to do it differently. As Jesus was preparing for His end of days, He left a message, a really clear message with His disciples. And He said, if you want to tell the story, the counter narrative, do this. And so in John 13:35, Jesus says that your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. That your love for one another, the way that you treat people, the way that you engage and have rhetoric and conversations around this, will prove to the world, because that is God's goal, that the world would engage more around things that are counterintuitive, the parts of the counter narrative of love, humility, servanthood, inclusivity, not exclusivity, instead of the other. And so this week, as you engage your faith, as you look for practical ways to live this out, one, I would say consider the ways that you have benefits and privilege and that you exist in the prevailing narrative, and set some of that aside to start telling the counter narrative. Get involved with people in these different groups that don't benefit from the prevailing narrative and start asking questions, getting more close and in proximity to these people that are in different categories, and show them love, ask some questions, and tell the counter narrative of hope and love, because the world needs to know that that will win out. We didn't hear the stories of the 50-some million people who attended church in the same weekend. We are all telling a narrative, and we all have a narrative, a story to tell. Which story will live? Make some decisions. This week, pray about it. Pray for the situation, and also pray what God's asking you to do. And then consider how you can creatively serve. How can you apply, not fight, not flight, but a careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice? What does that look like for you? Does it mean gathering a group of people? Does it mean serving more? Does it mean asking more questions? Or does it mean calling out wrong where wrong is and not perpetuating hate? No longer pointing a finger and saying, but they did it first or they started it. Our faith is asking us to do this. God came, he cared enough about us to send his son to tell a different story. So let's tell that story. This week, very intentionally, tell a different story, because Jesus asked us to.